Good morning, and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, it's my pleasure to be here. Before we start, I want to remind the listeners that I have a new blog. It's under the old website address, InquisitionUpdate.org, and I try every day to recap what we've talked about here on the program in written form, so you can copy it and paste it and send it around. And you can go again to InquisitionUpdate.org to see those updates daily. And also you can check the link to the old website and peruse the information provided there. And hopefully we'll continue to keep things rolling with the new website. And also, if you'd like to contact me, please do so at tom@seawaves.us. That's tom at SEAWAVES. And I will, seawaves.us, by the way, not .com or anything like that, .us. And I usually answer most email that I get if it requires an answer. Most people just like to send me information, videos, documented information having to do with the Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order, and I thank all my listeners for their submissions. And but if you would like for me to read a particular book here on the program, comment about it, or if you'd like to have me interview a particular guest, please make your recommendations, and I'll take them under advisement. But the business at hand this morning is our continuing of reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, one of the most important books in my library, and I hope that the reading and discussion of this book will inspire people to get their own copy of this book and to share it with friends and family. It's a book to be comprehended, especially by Christians in this country today, whether they be Catholic or Protestant, evangelical, or by whatever flavor of Christianity. Find out what's really going on in this country today. R.W. Thompson predicted the very things that are happening in this country today. And he described what their purpose would be, what the end would be for this country, and who were the ones to be watched. The thesis of this book is that there's no power on earth outside of the country that could ever bring this country to its knees. There's only one power in the whole world that could ever topple our form of government and our way of life, and that is a domestic foe. A foe that exists within the country, and that foe does exist within the country, and it is called Roman Catholicism. Now, for those who have never heard such an outrageous statement before in their lives, would certainly be curious enough to investigate it. And I invite anybody and everybody to investigate this and to continue reading and listening to Inquisition Update as we read this book on the air. Now, we were talking about John Huss, the Bohemian Christian who rebelled against the Roman Catholic Church and was teaching, pointing out the errors of the Church, and who was eventually summoned to a council and condemned for heresy and burnt at the stake. But they failed to put out the light of the gospel in Bohemia. And the memory of John Huss continued, and so did his preaching. And it led the Pope to declare a crusade against the Hussites in Bohemia. And it says, the Pope now gathered an army of Italian... Oh, by the way, and if you're following along, we're on the first full paragraph on page 552, repeating just a little bit for continuity purposes this morning, as always. Page 552, the first full paragraph says, The Pope now gathered an army of Italian, French, German, and English soldiers and sent them into Bohemia under the command of one of his cardinals to exterminate all who embraced the doctrines of John Huss. So here is a papal crusade led by one of the rosy red cardinals. You wonder why they wear red all the time. It's because they are the blood letters of the Roman Catholic Church. And this cardinal led a crusade against the Hussites in Bohemia. It says the Bohemians were not easily overcome, and they drove the papal troops out of their country. But the Pope, although thus defeated, was gratified that he had succeeded in stirring up a civil war in Germany, from which he hoped great gains to the papal cause. Therefore, he wrote to his defeated legate, quote, "You will immediately recruit new troops to recommence hostilities, and to wash out in the blood of the Hussites the opprobrium to which your name is covered. Let no consideration arrest you. Spare neither money nor men. Believe that we are acting for religion, and that God has no more agreeable holocaust than the blood of his enemies. Strike with the sword, and when your arm cannot reach the guilty, employ poison. Burn all the towns of Bohemia, that fire may purify this accursed land. Transform the country into arid steppes, and let the dead bodies of the heretics hang from the trees in greater number than the leaves of the forest." Unquote. How's that for good Christian charity? Coming from the very throne of St. Peter. The supposed throne of St. Is this how St. Peter would conduct the affairs of God? Not on your life. But this Pope, this papal institution, considers itself apostolic. And it promotes its religion by bloodshed, and it puts down any opposition by crusades and interdicts and excommunications and by public burnings at the stake, raising up an inquisition and binding every Christian under the Fourth Lateran Council that it is their duty to God to exterminate heretics. John Huss, a Bible-believing Christian under the teaching of Wycliffe, taught against popery, taught against the doctrinal beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. And this is how Rome answered the truth, with fire and with blood. Now, Pope Benedict XIII, having died, and Clement VIII, having resigned his claims to the pontificate — remember, there were many popes all claiming to be pope at the same time — Martin V became the sole possessor of the tiara in 1429, thus ending the Great Western Schism, which had for more than 50 years enabled the chief actors to exhibit themselves as ambitious, avaricious, vindictive, debauched, and cruel, solely occupied with duping men and changing the holy water into a stream of gold. Unquote. This gave to Pope Martin V more leisure to prosecute his war of extermination of the Hussites. And we have still further insight into the character of this war and the policy of this infallible Pope by the following letter addressed by him to the King of Poland, endeavoring to procure his aid in bringing back the Bohemians to the quote-unquote true faith, Roman Catholicism. Quote, "Know that the interests of the Holy See and those of your crown make it a duty to exterminate the Hussites. Remember that these impious persons dare proclaim principles of equality. They maintain that all Christians are brethren, and that God has not given to privileged men the right of ruling the nations. They hold that Christ came on earth to abolish slavery. They call the people to liberty, that is, to the annihilation of kings and princes. While there is still time, then, turn your forces against Bohemia. Burn, massacre, make deserts everywhere, for nothing could be more agreeable to God or more useful to the cause of kings than the extermination of the Hussites." Unquote. Excuse me. Now, I want to ask my listeners a question. Many of you have heard of Bohemian Grove, this outrageous vacation spot near San Francisco, California, where every year the elite of the world, the most elite in every realm of endeavor in this country, gather among the giant trees in the forest, and they culminate their festivities with a mock sacrifice. It takes place in the form of a Roman Catholic Mass. And at the end of the Mass, of course, every Mass requires a sacrifice. And they sacrifice a human caricature on a fire in front of a stone owl. And they call this the cremation of care. It's the place is called Bohemian Grove. And one has to wonder, as much as the papacy hated these Hussites, and as much as he did to exterminate the Hussites, I just wonder if there's any connection between this crusade that is ordered against the Bohemian Hussites and what takes place in Bohemian Grove at the cremation of care amongst the tall trees in Bohemian Grove by San Francisco, California. I wonder if there are any of my listeners that have researched to see if there's any direct connection between that ritualistic burning of a heretic at Bohemian Grove, if it has anything to do with exactly what we're reading right now. He says again, "Know that the interests of the Holy See and those of your crown make it a duty to exterminate the Hussites. Remember that these impious persons dare proclaim principles of equality. They maintain that all Christians are brethren and that God has not given to privileged men the right to ruling the nations. They hold that Christ came on earth to abolish slavery. They call the people to liberty, that is, to the annihilation of kings and priests. While there is still time, then, turn your forces against Bohemia. Burn, massacre, make deserts everywhere, for nothing could be more agreeable to God and more useful to the cause of kings than to the extermination of the Hussites." Remember that it's Bohemian Grove in San Francisco where all the kings of the earth go to play, to have their mock sacrifice. They call it Bohemian Grove. Now, Pope Martin V did not live long enough after issuing this bloody edict to witness its desolating effect upon the Bohemians. The gallant Hussites, invigorated by the consciousness that they were defending an inalienable right which God had given them, rallied like true soldiers to the defense of their principles and their homes, and cut the papal army to pieces, driving it back in dismay and disgrace. At their hands, liberty won another triumph over imperialism, and the cause of free conscience was, under the protecting providence of God, still preserved. You must know that the papacy absolutely abhorred the Bohemians for destroying his army. And it says, the shock which the Pope sustained when the sad news reached the Vatican was too great for him. Finding himself thus defied, and with an army routed and dispirited, he was seized with a fit of apoplexy and died, disappointed in his hopes, and despised by all except those who were united with him in the effort to keep the people in degradation and perpetuate the reign of papal and imperial absolutism. But he lived long enough to show the world that the canon of the Fourth Lateran Council, which commanded the extermination of heresy by force, was still the law of the Church, and that from it the papacy derived the leading and governing principle of its action. With a view to the enforcement of this law, he proclaimed his infallibility, that he might the more readily grasp sufficient temporal power to unsheath the swords of princes and send forth their armies with torch and faggot to murder, to destroy, and to desolate some of the fairest portions of Europe. What impious blasphemy it is to say that God was on the side of the fiendish and infernal work prescribed by this Pope for the defenders of papal sovereignty. But the healing of the schism to which the pontificate of Martin V led did not put an end to the corruptions of popes, prelates, and priests. God seems to, listen to this, God seems to have permitted these to continue during the remainder of the 15th century and into the 16th in order that Christians would, in order that the Christian world might realize how far the papacy had departed from the teachings and practices of the apostolic age and be prepared for the ushering in of the Protestant Reformation. There, R.W. Thompson has articulated what I've tried to articulate several times in the last weeks, that the outrages committed by the papacy were allowed to occur by God so that no man could be deceived by the papal pretension of infallibility and that he is somehow God's vicar on earth. God simply used all of history to make a mockery of this human institution called the papacy and to proclaim him as Antichrist. Now, what right-minded individual, whether he be Catholic or Protestant, could read the history of these papal demons and not declaim them as Antichrist? Now it says, notwithstanding that torrents of blood were shed, and the fires of the terrible Inquisition were kindled, and gibbets and scaffolds were erected wherever the papacy had power, God did not design that the world should be longer ruled by depraved popes and priests. And therefore, by the consummation of that great event, he marked out for it new roads to happiness and prosperity, and to Christianity fresh triumphs of more peaceful fields. And thousands who had before felt the crushing weight of papal oppression and groaned under the burden, enlisted under the banner of religious freedom, which has been borne onward and upward through terrible trials until at last it floats in front of the Vatican at Rome, despite the curses and anathemas of Pope Pius IX, who that it might again be trailed in the dust before him, invites another crusade, revives the canon of the late Lateran Council, and gnashes his teeth to desperate rage, because there's no king upon any throne to do his bidding, and because mankind will not tamely submit to the pressure of his heel upon their necks. By the proclamation of his sovereignty, his infallibility, and his omnipotence, he leaves no room to doubt that he desires to turn the Christian world back from its progressive advancement, and I will say from its Protestant advancement, into the terrible condition from which the Reformation raised it, and by the substitution of terror, hatred, and intolerance for love, charity, and toleration, to win Again, universal supremacy for the papacy. To do this, he would enslave all the people who will not obey him, destroy all governments wherein the people have power, abrogate every law in conflict with papal enactments, restore the universal reign of kings, and establish a holy empire with ecclesiastical supremacy upon the ruins of all popular government. Upon the ruins of all popular government. That is, popular governments are those that govern for the people. The papacy will not tolerate the people having any say in government. The United States of America was the most popular of all popular governments in the world in the time of Pope Pius IX, and he declared open war against all popular governments in his encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864. And that's what R.W. Thompson is warning us about. We have a threat that can overthrow our Protestant constitutional republic. It is a domestic threat, and it is most easily described as the Roman Catholic Church. Again, R.W. Thompson was the Secretary of the U.S. Navy. It was his duty, his responsibility as the Secretary of the U.S. Navy concerned with the welfare of this nation to assess every threat, both foreign and domestic. Again, he said there is only one power on earth that could overthrow this government, and that would be a domestic power. And that domestic power is the Roman Catholic Church. Most Americans would never conceive that the Roman Catholic Church is in any way incompatible with our form of government. But the papacy has always gone to battle against kings and princes and nations or anybody who would assert their right to make their own laws, independent of the papacy. And we have, in this country, a fifth column of Roman Catholics, led by their bishops and their priests and their cardinals, that when the time is right, when it can be safely done without any damage to the church, they will overthrow our government. And I maintain for my listeners this morning that day has arrived. Now, R.W. Thompson is going to now open chapter 18 of this book. We're going to deal with many, many subjects, as with every chapter in this book, and I will dispense with the reading of the subjects that we're going to discuss and just get right to the meat of the chapter. R.W. Thompson says the dignity and power acquired by the Roman Catholic Church by means of the exercise of its spiritual jurisdiction, however great, was not sufficient to answer the ends and gratify the ambition of the medieval popes. No, they were not satisfied with just being priests. The popes had to be king of kings as well. They had to wield the temporal sword. They demanded that the kings of the earth answer to the Pope and the Pope alone, and that through them the Pope may rule the people. And we'll talk about it more on Inquisition Update when we return from the break. We'll see you in a few minutes.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left-behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Okay, welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. We're continuing the beginning of the chapter number 18 in the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. He says, the dignity and power acquired by the Roman Catholic Church by means of the exercise of its spiritual jurisdiction, however great, was not sufficient to answer the ends and gratify the ambition of the medieval popes. So what was lacking in the Roman Catholic Church, if it be just a church, if it be just ecclesiastical? How was that not sufficient to help the popes meet their end and gratify the ambition of the medieval popes? What is the end and the ambition of the popes of Rome? What is it that they wish? What is it that they most desire in the world? Not to just be a church, but to be a king of kings. What was lacking to uphold the spiritual jurisdiction of that church was a temporal jurisdiction. The Roman Catholic Church, the ambitions of the popes and the ends that they desire requires the temporal sword. Because as a church, it doesn't have the ability to conquer the world as the popes view as conquering the world. It's a physical, forceful overthrow of the legitimate governments of the world to establish a papal monarchy. That is, was, and always will be the goal of the papacy, to sit on the mount of the congregations in the sides of the north and to be like the Most High. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12 through 14. And you simply can't conquer the world if you only have ecclesiastical authority, because the people are still left to think as they please. You have to have the temporal sword to force people to acquiesce. the temporal sword is the power of the papacy. Strip from the Pope the temporal sword, and he's but a priest. He's nothing but a priest. So the drive, the end that they desired, the conquest of the world, is the only thing that will satisfy the ambitions of the popes. Now, he continues, he says, the frequent efforts of the Italian people to establish republican institutions, in other words, to kick the Pope out of the public affairs, and to establish a constitution with a republican regard for the people, was an offense to the papacy. It overturned his hierarchical structure and put the people on top and the Pope at the bottom. They relegated him to just a priest. And this has been repeated throughout history, that the Roman Catholics finally get fed up with the papacy trying to impose itself into the temporal affairs of their nation and to rewrite the laws of the nation to uphold the Pope's temporal power, and thus destroying the rights of the people to think for themselves, to read the Bible for themselves, and to come to their own conclusions based on the Scriptures. They attempt to overthrow these republican forms of government. And Italy, right there in the shadows of the walls of the Vatican, wanted their own government. They didn't want the Pope meddling in their temporal affairs. It was bad enough that he would be a priest, but they certainly were not going to allow him to control the king of their country and to turn the people into serfs. So Italy constantly battled the papacy to rein it back into the spiritual realm and kick it out of temporal affairs. But that doesn't suit the papacy. They want world conquest. They want to put their iron heel on the necks of anybody and everybody on the earth to beat the world into submission to their will. Now it says, the frequent efforts of the Italian people to establish republican institutions, which were often attended with the expulsion of the popes from Rome. That's right, the Italians kicked the popes out of Rome. They simply would not just return to their ecclesiastical realm. They simply would not take their heel off the necks of the people. They simply would not leave their governments to operate unmolested by the popes. So they kicked the popes out of Italy. Praise God! The Italian people, Catholic from stem to stern, had sense enough to kick the Pope out of their government. Kick the Pope out of Italy if it was necessary. And that's what they did repeatedly. The frequent efforts of the Italian people to establish republican institutions, which were often attended with the expulsion of the popes from Rome, were not intended as a denial of that jurisdiction, that is, the spiritual jurisdiction of the Pope in the proper sense, but as a means of limiting it to its own ecclesiastical sphere. Okay, the words are clear. The Italian people were fine if the Pope just maintained himself in his ecclesiastical environment, in his ecclesiastical role in Italy. But they were not going to allow him to take over the government. And it says, but the popes were not satisfied with this. With them, republicanism was synonymous with heresy, which they resolved to uproot with all the power necessary to that end. They denied totally the right of any people to make the laws or mold the institutions under which they were to live. Therefore, when Arnold of Brescia preached at Rome against the temporal power of the Pope and in favor of a republican form of government, the people were so incensed against Adrian IV, Pope Adrian IV, that they drove him out of the city. And when he was afterwards restored to his see by the army of Frederick Barbarossa, who delivered Arnold to him in consideration of his coronation as emperor, he consigned his patriotic victim to death at the stake and held the Roman people in subjection by force. Thus also we find the same Pope authorizing the like subjugation of Ireland by the English king and consigning its peaceful and Christian people to merciless cruelties of Henry II upon the ground that it was the portion of the patrimony of St. Peter and the Holy Roman Church. That's right, the Pope called Ireland a possession of the papacy, and he ordered King Henry II of England to subjugate Ireland for the Pope. Now it says, and this too, notwithstanding the Irish Church had grown up independent of Rome, had derived its faith from the canons of St. Patrick, and not from those of the Roman Church. They had appointed and consecrated their own bishops and priests. They had held their own synods, and had received the pallium from the Pope only 3 years before the commencement of Adrian's pontificate. Now, what significance does the pallium mean? The pallium is a garment, a woolen garment, worn by the Roman Catholic priests, worn by the priests of the Roman Catholic Church. And the presentation of the pallium to a nation is the papacy's way of bringing that nation into submission to Roman authority. Now, prior to this time, the church in Ireland was independent of Rome, but they received the pallium from the Pope, which is the means by which the Pope authorizes itself to subjugate that nation and bring it under Roman authority. I want to ask my listeners the question, has the United States received the pallium from the Roman Catholic Church? Is it now submitted to the authority of Rome? I suggest to you that if the pallium had not been submitted to the United States, there wouldn't be a papal nuncio in Washington, D.C. There would not be presidents of the United States of America boarding Air Force One and leaving Andrews Air Force Base on a direct course to Rome. And neither would the president or the wife of the president be wearing black. And neither would they be kneeling before the Pope and kissing his ring in private ceremonies at the Vatican. The United States has as much as signed a concordat with the Vatican. This is becoming a Roman Catholic country. This once Protestant nation is becoming a Roman Catholic nation right before our very eyes. And what is amazing, that we are ignorant of the history of the papacy, and we don't see Roman Catholicism as the threat that R.W. Thompson has assessed it to be. And it's time for us to wake up. That's why this book is so important. Now, the papacy, extending its jurisdiction even further, had to get control of Ireland, had to get control of the church in Ireland. So it was offered the pallium to be worn by the priests of Ireland, subjecting them to Roman authority. And it says the idea that all this enormous and comprehensive power was derived from the pretended donation of Constantine was fast becoming obsolete, for the reason that if that were its only foundation, it would be circumscribed within two narrow limits. Now, what is the donation of Constantine? It's this forged document of the Roman Catholic Church that says that the Emperor Constantine left his jurisdictions to the Pope of Rome. But see, the Pope used that all throughout its nativity and its growth, which has now extended beyond the borders of that ground, of that territory, that jurisdiction that was controlled by Constantine. So the papacy has literally outgrown the donation of Constantine. The donation of Constantine authorized the Pope to rule the areas of the Caesar's jurisdiction. Well, Ireland laid outside of that jurisdiction. Ireland was never included in the Holy Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire, as it were. So now the papacy has to find other bases to justify its extending its temporal jurisdictions beyond that which was contained in the donation of Constantine. And it says to enlarge rather than to curtail it was what the popes of that age especially sought for. Hence they maintained the more steadily the idea of their own personal infallibility. What's the answer to the problem of the limitations set by the donation of Constantine? Why, you simply declare the Pope to be infallible. And if the world believes and acquiesces to this idea of papal infallibility, then if the Pope says, well, then Ireland belongs to my jurisdiction, the world has to acquiesce because the Pope's infallible. He no longer needs the donation of Constantine. He no longer needs to bind himself to the limits of the old Roman Empire. He can extend his temporal jurisdictions anywhere he pleases because he's infallible. You see how necessary infallibility is to the papacy? And that's what it's all about, to extend the temporal jurisdiction of the Pope. And listen, if under this phony, bogus, lying inference that the Pope is infallible, Ireland's just the beginning. Now it includes America, South America, Arctic, Antarctic, Africa, Asia, the Philippines, Australia, and every inch of this planet, because he's infallible. And he can set his own jurisdiction. He can apply his spiritual and temporal sword anywhere on the earth, whether it be land or water. You see, the papal monster is out of its box now. He no longer is confined to the temporal jurisdiction of Caesar, Constantine. He can set his own jurisdiction. And do you think Satan is going to exclude 1 square inch of this God-given earth? Satan is not going to give 1 inch of this God-given earth. He's going to take it all. And he's taken it under this pretense called papal infallibility. He said, hence they maintained the more steadily the idea of their own personal infallibility, in order by means of it to engraft upon the faith of the church the doctrine that their temporal power was derived from Christ through Peter. And therefore, having that origin was not confined to the papal states, but extended to the entire world, and subjected all nations and peoples to their dominion, within the domain of morals, no less than that of faith. Okay? Faith is the church, morals is the state. Okay? Morals is the jurisdiction, the natural jurisdiction of the state. The spiritual is that of the church. And the Pope has simply reduced the world to a global church-state system. That's been their aim all along. And they haven't renounced that. They haven't even denied it. Know what the papacy is all about. The only way you can understand what's happening in this country and the world is to understand what the papacy is all about. Now, R.W. Thompson knows how important it is to educate the American people of what the papacy is all about. And this book is more important today than it was the day that it was written back in 1876. If you want to know what the New World Order is, you first have to know what the Old World Order was. And that's when the popes ruled over the kings of the earth and the people were no count. They had no rights. They were told what to think, do, and say. And that's exactly what the New World Order is, too. And you can't comprehend it unless you comprehend that the Pope is at the head of all of it. The New World Order is simply the Old World Order restored. He says this domain was considered as almost without limitation, or at all events as broad enough to include not only the entire conduct of individuals in their public and private intercourse, but all such secular action of nations as involved questions of public or private morality. In other words, it encompasses everything, nothing excluded. Thus, monarchs were to hold their crowns and exercise their royalty at the will of the reigning pope. Nations were to execute only such laws as the Pope considered in conformity to the divine law, that is, Roman Catholic canon law, and to abrogate those which were not so. And he was to intervene between them and their citizens at his own discretion. In other words, the Pope could interject himself between the citizens of a land and their government any time he chose, and to release them from their allegiance, and to turn over their territorial possessions to the dominion of those who would obey his commands and execute his will. In other words, the papacy maintained the jurisdiction of overthrowing any government that defied him, and to use the people to overthrow that government by simply absolving them from any oath of allegiance to their nation or their king, and to raise an interdict and threaten spiritual damnation, excommunication, if they did not obey the Pope. And that's what the people did. They obeyed the Pope, they overthrew their kings, and then they all became slaves to the papacy. The papacy crowned himself king of that nation. King of kings and Lord of lords. That is the divine prerogative, so says the Pope. It's happening right here in the United States today. Quoting R.W. Thompson says, secular power was only to be tolerated as secular princes avowedly exercised it by commission from the Pope, unquote. In other words, no government had any jurisdiction or any right to exist, any right to rule the people unless it was commissioned by the Pope. King of kings and Lord of lords, the Pope, that's what he is in this world. He occupies the place of God Almighty in the world. And what could he be but Antichrist? Now, this doctrine had continued to grow and strengthen from the time when Gregory VII, the great Hildebrand, had excommunicated and deposed Henry IV, Emperor of Germany, and released all his subjects from their allegiance to him. Each of the succeeding pontiffs of the 11th and 12th centuries had avowed it whenever they could safely venture to do so. But it remained for Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, one of the leading and ruling spirits of the age, to make it a part of religious faith by engrafting it by virtue of his infallibility upon the dogmas of the Church. His towering and unsatisfied ambition stimulated him to use it as the means of making himself, quote, the general arbiter of differences and conservator of the peace throughout Christendom, unquote. His proud spirit chafed at the thought that any earthly potentate should equal him either in greatness or authority. Therefore, he required that, quote, all disputes between princes, unquote, should be referred to him, and if either party should refuse to obey the sentence of Rome, he was to be excommunicated and deposed, and a like penalty was to be visited upon those who refused to attack whatsoever refractory delinquent he should point out. In other words, they made it a matter of religious faith in the Roman Catholic Church that the people had a duty to overthrow their legitimate governments if the Pope so directed them. Hang on a second. My apologies, I'm still wrestling with some laryngitis and other problems, but I'll continue. And the Pope had extraordinary weapons to bring out against these kings. Forfeitures, interdicts, excommunications, and every form of ecclesiastical censure and punishment were of almost daily occurrence. You see, the Pope, if he has the power to damn you to hell, and if the people acquiesce to that power, he uses it on a daily basis. Why? because it's the instruments of his machinery to conquer the world. It says, even such monarchs as Philip Augustus and Henry IV quailed before him, and Peter II of Aragon and John of England, as we've already seen, ignominiously consented to convert their kingdoms into spiritual fiefs and to hold them in submission to the Pope upon the condition of paying an annual tribute to the Holy See in Rome. By virtue of the claim of infallibility, the power of arbitrary papal dispensations was carried to its extremest limit, even to the assertion of the exercise of the right to infringe the canons of the Church. That's right, the Pope even reserves to himself the right to disobey the very laws of the Church, even the canons of the popes, the decrees, the infallible decrees of the popes. At any time, if it's advantageous to the papacy, he can violate his own laws. This, again, colors the papacy as Antichrist, because Christ was completely in compliance with God's law. Had he violated one of God's commandments, he could not have been the Lamb, spotless and unblemished, necessary to be the salvation of God, of men on the earth. Had he violated even one of God's commandments, he would not have been a fit sacrifice to redeem mankind. Yet the papacy reserves to itself the right to violate any of its own laws when it advantages the papacy. He is indeed Antichrist. Lock, stock, and barrel, from stem to stern, from root to branch. The papacy is Antichrist, and history leaves no room for doubt about it. We'll continue on the broadcast tomorrow. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.